Recording. Welcome everybody to today's event hosted by the Ethics Center at Western Michigan University. I'm Sandy Borden, the director, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation about carceral higher education. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you know how you can participate in today's event. At any time during the program, you will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's conversation partners, and you can do that by typing your question into the chat. As time allows, we'll address as many questions as we can during the Q&A at the end of the conversation. We are recording this event, and I will be posting the link to our website, www.mich.edu/ethics, and I'll also send the link to everybody who registered for the event. Western students, if you're attending this event for signature credit, I'll be putting a link into the chat for you to record your attendance. There will also be resources in the chat about the speakers and about the Ethics Center. I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Western's Department of Philosophy and Western's Educational Foundation's MA program in the Department of Teaching, Learning, and Educational Studies. And now I'd like to welcome Rebecca Ginsburg, Director of the Education Justice Project at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and Dale Brown, Director of the Prison Education Outreach Program at Western Michigan University. Dale will be moderating today's conversation, so I will turn it over to you now, Dale.
All right, Sandy, thank you so much. And thank you to the Ethics Center for inviting us to talk during the fall lecture series. And just, for the opportunity to speak about this topic. Also, I've been around this lecture series in the Ethics Center for maybe 4 or 5 years now, and both as an attendee and a participant, and it's just been wonderful, right, and very enriching. And so, thank you for keeping that tradition alive and providing the service, and for allowing me to be a part of it. It's an honor. Yep, so I'm Dale, cool thumbs up. I'm Dale Brown. I'm a PhD student in the Interdisciplinary Studies program here at Western. It's a doctoral program, concurrently enrolled in the MA program in Educational Foundations. Before that, I was enrolled in the master's program in philosophy, and that's really where my interest in this topic, carceral higher education, started. And by the way, carceral is just another way to say places of confinement, right? So we're talking about jails and prisons, and it kind of widens it. Instead of just saying prison education, I say carceral, because I think a lot of this applies to places of detention, juvenile detention centers, for example, immigrant detention centers, and so on and so forth. So that's why carceral higher education. So interest started a while ago. I was part of an effort to make permanent a prison education program at Western when I was in the MA program, and I've been fighting that fight since. Before COVID stopped us, we were in the pilot phase of that program, so we were able to partner with the Michigan Department of Corrections and offer 4 non-credit bearing courses at the Lakeland Correctional Facility in Coldwater, Michigan. And I had the privilege of teaching and co-teaching a couple of those. And so that's one kind of way in which my interest in this topic is related. The other way is that my doctoral work is directly related to higher education for justice-involved people. So I had those two kind of concurrent and overlapping interests. All right, I'm boring myself talking about myself. So what I'm going to do now is I want to turn it over to Rebecca. Right, she's the reason that we're all here today. So thank you again, Rebecca, for joining us. And so I'm wondering if you would do us a favor and start by telling us about the Education Justice Project and how you got involved with higher education in prison, given your what I think is interesting background in English, the law, and architectural history.
Sure. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandra, for hosting the event, and thank you, Dale, for reaching out and inviting me to be part of this series. It's really an honor to be part of this series. It sounds quite wonderful. I want to acknowledge that there are several Education Justice Project members or EJP members that are here. I can see them in the attendance window. And so you guys, if there's something that I say that's not quite right, or you want to add or correct me, please do feel free to use that chat, because many people have long memories of and long involvement with EJP. So the Education Justice Project is a very comprehensive college and prison program. And I use the word comprehensive intentionally, and I'll say more about that in a minute, that has operated since 2008 out of the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And we operate with one facility, a men's medium security prison called Danville Correctional Center. I often refer to it just as Danville, which is a prison about 45 minutes drive from campus. We are comprehensive in that, although we started working offering academic programs, including 4 credit courses at the prison, we currently have 3 main areas of programming. The one is the college and prison program. We currently have 12 different programs at the prison, the 4 credit courses, academic advising, not-for-credit workshops, an anti-violence program, and several others that we can talk about as time allows. And the program grew organically in response primarily to students proposing new programs and initiatives and saying we should be doing more of this. How about adding that on? The second programmatic area within EJP is our reentry guide initiative. Because we work at a medium security prison, our students get released. Most of our students get released. And it was at an event with our released students that I was made aware of the need for better reentry materials to support them upon their release. They brought this up in the context of asking the university, asking EJP to produce those materials. And we agreed. At the time, I thought it would be, a little pamphlet or something with reentry resources like job training programs and housing programs. And it's a 200-page book currently that we update every year. The other guide that that EJP's Reentry Guide Initiative produces is a guide for people who are getting deported following incarceration. Many people don't know that if a foreign national is arrested for a felony in the United States, they will be likely tried in the United States. If convicted, serve time in the United States, and then following the conviction, they are likely to be deported. And our guide supports people who are being deported or expect to be deported to Mexico and Central America. The third major area of programming that EJP works on is much newer than the other 2, and that's what we are calling our prison to gown pathway. At least that's what we're tentatively calling it for now. I think this is the next frontier for college and prison programs. We now know that college and prison does good things, and we can talk more about the good that it does and the harm that it might do. But it's typically a program that's restricted to the walls of the prison. And those of us in this work, typically expect students to just make it on their own once they get released. Find a university, enroll, and continue your education or not. And it's become clear to me and to others over the years that it's not that easy, and that especially students who are system impacted, by which I mean they've served time in prison, or they typically have a conviction, maybe they haven't served time in prison. It's really hard for them to enroll in universities upon release, and it's especially hard for them to enroll in our university upon release. So we are currently engaged in some research that will help us better understand both the challenges for systems-involved students who wish to get into and succeed at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And by succeed, I mean graduate. That's typically what most students want to do when they enroll in a university. That's their aim. And also where the points of support are on campus, because we want to bolster those points of support and provide the resources and the services that will be, that might be helpful in helping them succeed. We are looking for, we've got a grant that allows us to do that exploratory work. And I imagine that in time, this initiative will be as large a program and as robust a program as the work that we are doing on the campus. I mean, at the prison itself.
Yeah.
I faltered a minute because I saw that Chris Beasley just joined, and Chris has been in this work for many more years than I have, and he is quite expert. In fact, maybe we'll hear from him later about supporting formerly incarcerated students to continue their education on the outside. So those are the three things that EJP does. I think the second part of your question is, how did I get involved?
Yeah, yeah, especially given your background, but you can pick and choose.
So I'm going to push back a little bit on the, especially given my background.
Sure, please. Oh, please.
Because, and you're not the first to say something, Dale, like, oh my goodness, you're an architectural historian. Why should you care about prisons?
Oh, that's not what I was going for, but I'm happy to qualify. You go for it. Yeah.
Okay. And you would not have said that.
No.
So I was drawn to college and prison work, to prison work primarily through my interest in prison abolition. In fact, solely through my interest in prison abolition. I was a graduate student at Berkeley. That's where I got my PhD in architectural history. And I have a very vivid memory of thinking about prison abolition as I was walking down a hallway. I don't know why I was thinking about prison abolition. It had been on my mind. So you know how when things are on your mind, they pop into your mind as you walk down random hallways on campus. And I can remember it was to my left that I saw a notice for a college and prison program and on the bulletin board. And I said, this is interesting. I'm not interested in college and prison, but I am interested in prison abolition. And I bet if I go to this meeting about college and prison, there'll be a lot of folks there that are abolitionists, and I'll get hooked into some abolitionist organizations.
Yep.
And that's what I did. And of course, nobody at the meeting talked about, this was 1996 or 7, 1997 maybe. Nobody at the meeting talked about prison abolition. And by the end of the meeting, I wasn't very interested, frankly. I was not concerned to develop programs within prisons. I was interested in actions that would reduce and remove the use of penal incarceration.
Yeah.
And somebody came up to me afterwards as I was getting ready to literally, quite frankly, to walk out of the room, and said, hey, so glad you're here. Would you be interested in teaching a course? The reason I said yes behind gritted teeth was because I was the only visibly person of color in the room. And even back in 1997, I knew that incarceration disproportionately impacts people of color, Black and brown people in particular. And it seemed to me that the person who approached me, and I can't tell you, I don't remember who that person was, but I often think of that person and I say, thank goodness they had the courage to come up to me, a stranger, and ask me to teach for free in the program, because I would not have continued with this work had they not had the courage to do that. And it makes me often think about how I need to often get up the courage and speak to strangers and recruit them in ways more assertively even than I do. So I agreed to do it, and I still do it. When I became a faculty member at University of Illinois, it was something I brought up at my job interview. I said, this is work I've been involved with for the past few years. If I were to come here, I would want to continue to be involved with it. I do it not out of subject matter interest, not because it connects to the work that I was doing as an architectural historian or in any of my other, well, that's the only work I was doing as an architectural historian. I do it because I'm interested as an academic in ensuring that I don't follow the market in determining who I teach and who I work with. I think it's a danger for professors and architects and dentists and all of us who are in the professions to simply make ourselves available where we can be financially supported. And the dangers of that are quite obvious. And it was very clear to me as a graduate student that I didn't want to work only with people who could afford to pay tuition, and I didn't want to work on a campus where the criteria for entrance would be financial well-being. Um, so it was that drew me to the work, not because I wanted to teach architectural history, or not because my architectural history research interests coincided with prison work, although in the end, in fact, they do. But because as an academic, and I had returned to school after working for some time, and I had returned to school to graduate school with the intention of making a difference. And I knew that it would be, my ability to make a difference would be limited if I restrained myself to the traditional model of teaching and service. I'll stop talking now.
No, I think that's wonderful. That's actually what I was getting at. Because I'm interested in these different kinds of I say again, but our conversation was before this started, so I'll try to back up a little bit more. I saw that in your background there was some, right, it wasn't just a liberal arts or humanities type education, it was like a legal professional aspect of it, right? And so I think those, like, I think those things matter. I don't know. I think about my own. So I have my background is a little bit diverse in the same way, and that's the direction I was going. So, like, I have a technical education in residential construction, and then I got a business degree, which I hated, but that's my professional training. And then I took a hard swing toward philosophy, and I've been there. And I don't like. I'm with you in that it took me a long time to realize that I love philosophy because I love doing it for people, and that it was a skill set, and that, like, although I do find the content interesting, like, I'm not, it's not my jam just to go talk about old dead white dudes all the time. And that's not why I like to go teach in a prison. I like to think about education. I think is that idea of access to education, and like how I can be of service, leveraging like the luck that I've had. I think that's very important. And in speaking about recruiting educators, right, that's the role I'm thinking about now, is like if there is a program in place, how do you make that pitch for someone who maybe loves teaching, I don't know, Kantian ethics or something, or whatever it happens to be. How do you get them to come to a program where it might matter more about how you present yourself as an educator, or how you think about education in a holistic sense? So I think your response was like right down that road, and I think is wonderful. So thank you for that. Yeah,
Just the truth.
yeah. I don't know. I also thought of so many things in your response too. I mean, the tension. I guess I'll go there now. The tension between a university and a prison, right? Like those two entities, like they come together in parts and they also come apart in many ways. So I'm wondering what you think, like what, in some sense, I see that a university is just an ideal partner. Like higher education is not the only way to learn the things that we do, but it happens to be, in my opinion, one of the best, right? I'm thinking about, I've been reading Old Dead White Dude, Emerson, and he's saying, look, universities are at the best, not when they aim to drill and skill, right? But when they aim to create. And we gather he said something like the rays of various genius from all around the world, everywhere, throughout time, and we use those rays, we concentrate them to set the hearts of the students on flame. I think that's right. I think that's very beautiful. And I mean, I don't know. I get lost in that. I actually forget where I was going with it, but I like that. That's what I've been thinking about as of late, right? So, on the one hand, university has its own competing set of goals. Some to create, and I'm trying to wrap this back into your response, right? We have some version of we go to college to get a job, right? This is a very common mode of thinking about college. Or we go to college here's another line of thinking, to change in some meaningful way. So those are competing. And then we have, right, what could or should happen in a prison. I don't know, that's unwieldy. So let me try to narrow it back down. Sorry. universities are great for teaching people in prison in some ways, and they're not so great in other ways. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to that simple dynamic. Like it's putting a very difficult question into a simple dynamic dichotomy. I'll say that.
Okay. I think maybe the dichotomy for me lies a little bit elsewhere.
Sure.
I think universities are great for teaching higher education to people who are incarcerated. In fact, I think universities or colleges are the only vehicle that should be providing higher education to people in prison. I know in some jurisdictions there's a move for departments of correction to take the initiative or the lead in providing higher education to people in prison, and I think that's misguided.
Yeah.
I don't think departments of correction should be doing that work. I think universities do it better with more integrity. And I think that I think they should be doing it. I think public universities anyway, like Western Michigan and University of Illinois, as public universities have, I can speak specifically about the responsibility of a land grant institution like University of Illinois. I don't know enough about WMU to tell you what you should be doing, but let me speak for myself. We're a land grant institution. We're the largest public university in the state. And we have a commitment, an explicit commitment to serving all the residents of the state, especially those most, as a land grant institution, most left out of, not included in higher education traditionally. And so it makes it incumbent on us to do the work of going where the students are, as I like to say, going where the students are. And many of the students in a jurisdiction that is experiencing mass incarceration are in prison. Many of the Black and brown students in particular are in prison. So there's more I could say about that, but I just want to say I think universities are the ideal entity to be providing higher education in prison. I also think, and I think this is one of the things you were getting to, Dale, is that universities and prisons don't always play well together.
Right.
We're both state actors, and we don't have private prisons in Illinois. I don't know about Michigan. So in Illinois, there are state prisons and there are public universities. So we both serve the same, we have the same master, which is the people of the state of Illinois. We ostensibly have a similar mission to support and the well-being of the people of the state of Illinois. And yet we have such different visions of what well-being looks like and what health and security look like. Although we're both big bureaucracies as well, we have different, our bureaucracies are animated with different sets of values. And I would be the very last person to defend the values that animate the University of Illinois' bureaucratic systems, because I find them very difficult to maneuver. At the same time, I find that the bureaucratic systems within the Illinois Department of Corrections, which are often, to my mind, animated by a desire to avoid responsibility, fear of losing one's job because so many of the appointments are bureaucratic gubernatorial appointments. I have no idea what that is actually, but I'm sure nothing will blow up. That and overall the missions of the two entities being so very different, where one is ostensibly at its best, right? Committed to learning and exploration and curiosity and exploring and breaking boundaries, again, at its best. And the other being quite explicitly committed to confining people so that they don't explore and that don't think for themselves, can't move for themselves. And the punitive ethos, despite language of rehabilitation, which is equally troubling, and I don't mean to, I hope maybe we can talk about rehabilitation at some point, but the punitive ethos that prevails within most institutions is kind of counter to the ethos and the mission of our universities. For this reason and for others, I feel that, and I've certainly seen that universities and institutions of prisons rub up against one another, and it's okay. My bottom line is, many people have heard me say this, the day that we stop experiencing friction in the work that we do at the prison is a day that we need to say, what are we doing wrong? Or why have we become less committed to our values in this space? Because as I've painted the picture, and as I've painted the opposing sets of missions and values and animating principles, you would expect, and we need to see that rubbing up and that friction. At its best, it's a healthy friction. At best, it's a healthy friction that allows us to run a program in a prison. And at its worst, at its most destructive, it harms incarcerated scholars and it harms the programs that are trying to work with them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, how do you, or I mean, you say just like the royal we, how do we navigate the tension? Like, so for example, people suggest that we have the same goals, right, on the campus and for non-incarcerated students, and the same goals for incarcerated students, right? That what we're getting at is not equality, because we can't do that, because they're not compatible in that way. But we can shoot for equity, right? And I'm wondering what you think about that. Like, how, to the extent that we can, how should we? I mean, programs that are there's a lot of programs that are about to come online, right? So that's one worry. I know you talk a lot about quality higher education. I think rightfully so, right? Because just higher education in prison is not exactly the answer. It has to be the right kind, right? So if programs are thinking about this, something that I'm thinking about, how do you see equity between the two institutions? Right? Do we have? I mean, you've already given part of the answer, is that we need, like, it can't just be about the class, it's got to be about more. So your EJP offers other services, right? Is that the kind of answer that you would give in terms of equity? I mean, even in terms of class offerings, the way that we're offering the class.
So we can't offer equity, if I understand equity the same way you do. And the reason we can't is, and by equity I mean some comparable conditions of education.
In a broad sense.
Yeah, in a broad sense. And we can't provide that. But we try our best to offer quality. One of the things we require within each EJP syllabus, for example, is a statement of how this course is different at the prison than it would be if it were being offered on the traditional campus at Urbana-Champaign. And some of the things that professors list in those statements of difference are things like, on campus, my students would have access to the internet. On campus, I have office hours twice a week, and the students drop by to talk to me. On campus, the students have access to a library of 50 gazillion volumes, and you don't have that. On campus, my students are able to meet together in coffee shops to discuss the materials directly after class and form study groups, and you can't do that. And I could go on, and we could all think of 50 ways off the top of our heads that, even if the content is the same, even if the assignments are the same, so the conditions of instruction, the conditions under which learning takes place are not similar, and they are typically dissimilar in ways that disadvantage incarcerated students. Not always. I mean, it's possible to perhaps exploit those conditions for enhanced learning. I'm trying to think of an example. I know we have had examples, but typically these conditions operate to disadvantage the incarcerated students. So I think we continue to try our best. We, the royal we again, we continue to push the boundaries against departments of corrections that seek to constrict and limit what we can do at the prison, to bring in more books, for example, to expand the computer lab, to offer more tutoring hours outside of class, I spend a lot of my time strategizing what to ask for.
Hmm.
An awful lot of my energy and energy that with other EJP members is consumed with, okay, we've got these 3 asks. Which one is most important? Which one are we likely to say yes to? Which one, what order should we place them in order to be more that it's more likely that our requests to the Department of Corrections, to
Okay, I was going to ask, is it to not, well, I'm sure some of them are to your university, but most of them are to the DOC because they're more
very few of them are
picky
to our
and
university.
bureaucratic.
They're almost all to, it's almost very few of them are to the university. They're almost all to the prison, and it's because it's at the prison, at the site of the prison, where we run up against those limitations to our practices as instructors and to the students' practices as
Yeah.
scholars.
Yeah.
And it's a interesting position to be in, constantly strategizing how to get more, and to expand and to push and to, take a little bit here and maybe we'll get a bit more there, an extra room. Can we bring the big one of the big struggles right now recently has been to bring in pens, because the only pens that the students have available to them at this moment in the prison that we are based at, and things change all the time, as you know, are little, I call them golf pens because I'm thinking of golf pencils. You know what it is? It's like a pen refill. If you take out an old-fashioned pen and open up an old-fashioned pen, the refill, especially it's maybe that big, the refill is what our students can have access to. And the students are typically, their hands are much bigger than mine, and my hands get cramped with those little bitty pens. And so when they're writing for long periods of time, their hands get cramped and the pens don't hold very much ink. So we've been campaigning. We thought we were successful, and we've turned out we weren't successful, to bring in very cheap and plain rudimentary Bic pens to the prison. Just an example of how much of the work, as I've defined it, or as I find myself doing it, consists in pushing forward, maybe is a better way of putting it, of pushing forward in order to provide what I think of as basic needs for the program and for the students.
Yeah, pens. I mean, it's worth emphasizing, just pens, because I've run into the same sorts of, just things that we would consider. We're not talking about computers, right? Or like anything sophisticated. We're talking about like literally notebooks, pens, books, post-it notes. Yeah. What I wanted to mention too is that how arbitrarily bureaucratic those decisions can be, at least in my experience, right? And inconsistent. You can bring it this week, but you can't. You had the list of the things that you could bring, but you didn't list the bag in which the things are in, so you cannot bring the bag. And I say this because I think it really highlights, right? I want to make sure to say out loud that I know that that's just a tiny fraction of what the students experience, right? And I know that I could never understand their entire experience, but I just getting those little bits here and there, it's just maddening. And right, so those are some of the. It's worth thinking about, right? The conditions in which the students are learning it, and that's not to say anything about a kind of broader analysis of the conditions of prison, right? They're just our learners in out.
Yeah. It's also worth keeping in mind when we fight those battles, to keep our end goals in mind, and I think one of the things I've learned is how to let go of battles in this work. I also think it's worth going back, if you don't mind, Dale, to a point that you raised earlier about recruiting instructors and recruiting. In our case, it's not just instructors that we recruit, because we have these 12 different programs. We have all sorts of, at any given semester, we have 60 to 70 people who are going into the prison.
Wow.
Facilitating workshops or tutoring or doing academic advising or teaching a 4-credit course or any other number of things. And I think one of the things I've learned is that tempting in the early days to speak up, to instruct, to recruit people by letting them know that these were fantastic students, better than any students that they would ever encounter on the traditional campus, and that teaching will be a really fulfilling and intellectually exciting experience. And the reason I don't do that anymore is not because it's not true, but because I don't want people to come to this work for that reason, or only for that reason, or primarily for that reason. I don't want the prison to be a respite from everyday world.
Because the focus is on the instructor and how it makes it better.
Focus on the instructor, and because the focus is also on it being a respite, an other from the everyday world. And one of the things we try very hard to do is to help our members understand why prisons are part of our everyday world, and not to treat them as exotic, foreign places that we go to, like, as if for a teaching retreat, to engage with these really super smart, super engaged people, and then we come back to the regular world where we will dig down and do better work. Because what we need, what I think has to be understood and appreciated if we're going to move forward with some of the larger social goals that I have anyway, is to understand that the people that are incarcerated are not foreign beings, nor are they disconnected from our world. I mean, obviously they're physically disconnected, and we can talk more about that, but they are, you know, brothers, sons, fathers, cousins. They write back and forth, they call back and forth. What happens in the prison impacts what happens in our communities. What happens in our communities impacts what happens in the prison. These are integral parts of, we all live together in this, in our larger, broader communities. And I think, to get back to the question of recruiting, I have learned to place more emphasis, or I try to remind myself to pay more emphasis on sort of our obligations as a university and the social good that attaches to higher education in prison for students and for everybody, for the society as a whole, and the way that higher education in prison can serve abolitionist ends. Then I have you will have a lot of fun in the, I don't think I ever said this, I'm exaggerating now, but you will have a lot of fun teaching in the prison. The students are great, and they do all their assignments on time, and they do the readings really early.
It's true. Yeah. I even listen to you. I'm going to have a hard time not mentioning that because I have to make courses harder. I honestly, that's people say, like, that we're worried about making them easier. It's the other way.
It's absolutely the other way.
Yeah, but it's also true in my experience that it's just more work. It's just more straight up work in preparing and lesson planning and grading by hand, right? Because of the lack of technology, and I'm sure that varies from program to program. But I do take very seriously your point that we should emphasize these other things. I'd like to ask about the social goods of prison education, because I think those are very interesting, and I think they're tied. To recognize them, we have to get past what I guess I think of as core misunderstandings about people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated, right? And I mean, I mentioned to you in an email that I had just finished, obviously with my PhD, I'm reading about a lot of this, but I just finished Bruce Western's book. There's someone on the call here, a sociology professor at WMU, Dr. Schneider. She recommended it to me, and I'm thankful. Because what I think Western does is he kind of crystallizes some of these core misunderstandings, right? In terms of like social environments, right? So we don't want to characterize anybody really, or people in prison specifically, as like poor or violent, but we see that they come from communities, right, which are impoverished, right? They come from communities in which they're not just the perpetrators of violence. They've typically been a witness, right, and a victim, right? There are these factors of mental illness and physical illness and drug addiction. And then when you mix in age is another one that Western talks about. And I think in all of these areas, people don't generally, maybe this isn't fair, people don't quite understand how that might factor into a person who becomes involved in the system, and then like what the system does at that point. And I don't like, there's not a, I just got excited to talk about that, right? I don't exactly have a question, but
Oh, can I respond to your
please.
non-question?
Yeah, I do have a question, but please respond so I can stop talking.
I agree. Of course, I agree. And I want to say that one of the things we do within EJP to counter that is we very intentionally try to demonstrate our work, illustrate the work that we do, and to put out images. Here, again, it's an advantage. It's not an advantage. It's one result of my being an architectural historian is that in my earlier professional life, I was around a lot of people who were very visually oriented, and I continue to learn from my architectural history and my art history colleagues that images are very powerful, and so we try to put out as many images, not as many as we can. We are very intentional about putting out images of incarcerated scholars that debunk and refute dominant prejudices about incarcerated people. And we even have a guideline for representing students in a set of guidelines for representing students who are within college and prison programs that our students wrote up. Because it's very easy to, so a couple of things. One thing is that when I tell people I work with the Director College and Prison Program, people will often say to me something like, oh, that's so important. I'm glad you do that work. Literacy is so very valuable. And I will say it's a college and prison program. So yes, so indeed, literacy is valuable, but I don't teach people how to read. They're taking U of I, advanced U of I courses, sometimes at the graduate level. So there's an assumption that the students are doing, the assumption that Black and brown people are not very smart. Let me just put it that way. And that the incarcerated people who are predominantly Black and brown are doing work that is not, it couldn't possibly be equal to the work that students are doing on that regular students are doing on the traditional campus. So we try to put out images and posts and information that rebuts that. So for example, when a local news organization recently came to the prison, we were quite intentional about having them sit in the computer programming or the statistical modeling, I can't remember what it was called, in the class that contained material that I didn't understand, which is to say it was advanced material related to programming, which helped. And the newspaper, I mean, not the newspaper, the anchor, the news anchor said, I don't understand what they're doing. I loved that. I loved that she didn't understand what they were doing.
Yes.
The other thing is, maybe I'll stop there. There's more I could say, but I wanted to say, but the main point I wanted to make was that, what was the main point I wanted to make?
I don't know. I mean, you made it to me. Like representation, right? So, you know, I mean, I think more than they just think people can't learn in prison. It's like that they might think that they're monsters, right? So I wanted to ask my question. I was trying to tie it into moral ambiguity, because it is the case that people are there for committing or allegedly committing a crime, right? So and then we learn that you know, we might have had an idea that most people are in prison for drug charges, and maybe that's true at the federal level, but not in the state level, right? We have this issue of violence, and I said it before. And though it is, I mean, maybe I'd prefer to think about it. I mean, I mentioned the social factors that go into it. So, but the fact that people, so when we realize that a lot of convictions are for violent offenses, I don't know if there's a tendency for people to downplay that. And what was the point I was making? It was that there is that moral ambiguity there.
I don't think there's anything ambiguous about it, but I appreciate the question. And in fact, when
we get to it.
when I was
I didn't quite figure it out before I said it, but please.
I think I told you before people joined us, Dale, that I was speaking at the University of Missouri last week, and somebody in the audience asked me, great work, the program sounds fantastic, college and prison sounds great, but what about people who are serving life sentences, really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The implication, of course, being that we should not provide education to people serving life sentences. He meant it mostly because it wasn't of use to him that somebody serving a life sentence should receive an education because his life was never going to intersect with that person's.
Yeah.
But it's also I often hear that as a moral concern. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to take that moral concern seriously, that there are people who believe that the work that we do is morally suspect, I won't even say ambiguous, morally suspect or morally wrong, because we are rewarding people who have harmed others by giving them not just something of value, but something of value that people on the outside, people who have lived upstanding lives and who didn't end up in prison, have to pay for and have to sacrifice for. And there's something to some people, for many people, that strikes them as fundamentally unjust. And I think I find it helpful to listen to those people when I encounter them face to face, to listen to those people and to hear because for several reasons. One of the reasons is that they are often expressing a sense of injustice and unfairness and frustration that is very real and experienced by many people in the United States who operate under the system in which we do in the United States, in which they can't afford to send their children to University of Illinois or to university, or that they weren't able to have the kind of education that our incarcerated students are getting. And that's not right. And I agree with them that it's not right that they were not able to get that kind of education if they wanted that education, or that they have to work so hard and sacrifice so much to get their children into school because of the economics and cost of higher education in the United States. And I think many of us tend to dismiss those concerns too quickly, or rather to not engage those people enough and to hear them and to hear the concern and the frustration and the sorrow that is sometimes implicit in the anger that they express towards the fact that we're doing this kind of programming.
Yeah.
The second thing I want to say is that I think it's so important, and I'm glad you raised it, to talk about harm and violence, and to talk about victims, and to talk about the hurt that we perform on one another, the hurt that we subject one another to in so many ways, at personal and systemic ways within our society, and to acknowledge that many of our students have hurt others. Many of our students, disproportionate numbers of our students of our incarcerated students, are victims of harms themselves.
Yep.
I think that the punitive mindset into which so many of us in the United States are committed, to which so many of us are committed and trapped, is so very damaging, in that it makes it harder for us to open the lens wider. When I open my lens wider, and this is the way I encourage my students to think about harm and violence, is that it's very messy and it's very interconnected, and in fact, I tend to use the phrase putative victim rather than victim when describing the victim of any given incident, because there's always a backstory, right?
Yeah.
And there's always a backstory, and the putative offender is, in one instance, was 2 days ago the putative victim, and 2 days ago was subject to this and to that. And what we need to become better at doing as a society is expanding the lens in which we assess and understand harms to have occurred. And then we need to bring to our examination of those events a much stronger dose of compassion than we currently allow ourselves to feel.
Yeah.
So often the impulse is, so predictably, the impulse is to to put an end as quickly as possible to the analysis, and to determine the victim and the offender, or the victim and the perpetrator, to punish the perpetrator, and to close it up in a nice, easy box, which also incidentally has the effect of warehousing lots of Black and brown people in facilities.
Right.
You know, over-determination is written all over this scenario, right?
Yep.
Whereas what we need to have the patience and intellectual capacity and the heart to do is bring that camera back, widen the lens, ask more questions of any particular incident. What happened, and what will it take for this not to happen again?
Yeah.
And how can these people that were involved in this instance how can the harm be addressed? How can they be healed? How can community be restored? If it can be restored, sometimes it can't be restored, right?
Right. Right.
And I think there's a lot more to say about that, of course. But once we start going down that road, to me anyway, the notion that we would eventually find a solution by putting one of the parties that is involved in a cage and hurting him or her doesn't seem likely. And the fact and the idea that we would characterize that person as the one that hurt the other also doesn't seem likely.
Yeah. Or as a person who just hurt, like, or a bad person. Here's what I was getting. I think you answered it beautifully. The question, which I posed terribly. The moral ambiguity I was thinking about was of us as people as good or bad, holy, right? We like, we say you are bad. That doesn't make any sense because we're all some mixed bag of good and bad action, sometimes in the same moment, in the same day, right? And to fail to acknowledge the sort of ambiguity in which we operate as ethical, normal people every day is just absurd, right?
I don't think that takes us far enough, Dale, because we can still acknowledge that we have wide range of feelings and emotions and behaviors of which we are capable.
Yeah.
And that at some points we go way down this road a bit too far and hurt other people.
No doubt. Yeah. And right. So we go further, and I mean, again, I think you've said all the right things that I was hoping to get into. But like the idea that even if we do have one of these, we take one of those roads. We statistically we might age out of it at a certain time, right? So to put just a quick example, to put a 15-year-old in a cage for their entire existence for doing something heinous, let's just speculate, it makes zero sense to that person when they get older, right? Like we just don't remain the same person, right? And whatever argument you like, if it's a cost argument or hopefully something more akin to human dignity, right? It just doesn't make any sense.
It does make sense if you are committed to a retributivist view in
Sure.
which the person we're demonstrating society's abhorrence of the act.
Right.
It is very communicative in nature that we want to send a message about how heinous we felt that
Right.
act was. My response to that argument would be that we should not be animated by those values and those concerns.
Yeah.
I
mean, and most departments of corrections have this kind of conglomeration of goals that they're trying to meet. So they might also have that's one of the issues, right? They're not exactly clear. Are we trying to get at a backward-looking punishment? Are we trying to get at a forward-looking punishment like rehabilitation? Are we trying to is it about public safety? Because those things, right, like crime and putting incarceration as a punishment for crime, like as you've said, like we know that it doesn't do that much.
I didn't say that it doesn't do that much. I said that it's wrong.
Well, you mentioned overdetermination, right? So we know that as crime, there's like I don't know. This is the story. There was a crime peak, then it went down. Incarceration kept going up, right? Like
we know that
those two things didn't exactly they don't line up exactly.
Sure. I mean, we know that there's an impact on crime. Then incarceration has some kind of an impact on crime up to a certain point, and then when
Yeah.
you over incarcerate, it has a different impact on crime. We also know that prisons are criminogenic, which
Yeah.
is to say that people who are involved with the criminal justice system tend, as opposed to people who are equally situated but aren't involved with the criminal justice system, they're more likely to commit acts of harm and violence on others. And I don't mind resorting to those arguments against penal incarceration in particular audiences where people are interested in those sort of metrics. And I'm interested myself. I mean, I don't like harm. I don't like violence. I'm interested in those metrics myself. But they don't form the root of my opposition to penal incarceration.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no good reason. I can't think of a good reason to put a 15-year-old child in a cage, no matter how horrific the act that the 15-year-old committed. I think the only response to harm and the only sort of moral response to any act of harm and violence, but particularly harm and violence committed by a 15-year-old, is to ask what happened to you? What happened? Help us understand. Again, broaden out that lens. What led, what, not just individual circumstances, but larger contextual situation. What led to that? And what can we learn from this, both about how we can avoid that sort of thing happening in the future and what we can do to address the needs of the current situation, the needs of the current moment, with respect to the individuals that were involved.
Yeah. You know, what really hit me hard was Sured's Until We Reckon, because she was talking about, like, you know, when you ask the victim of a crime, like, we just exclude the victims, right? That's one of the things that we're talking about. We don't, our lens is here. We don't, you'd think it's logical to say, like, hey, do you want this person who harmed you, do you want them to go to prison? We don't ask that question. We don't even really give them a chance to speak about it unless it's in court at a trial, which 95% plus of cases are plead out anyways, and right, they don't. That is to say, they don't see a trial, which is to say that the victim doesn't get a chance to speak, and even when they do, it's usually performative. So we're not right. We're definitely not including them in the story, and then so we're not. So we just automatically exclude, like, a system of accountability, right? Or Sured's, she has like that. It's like a 5-step process for right, as an alternative to incarceration, to for restoration, right, or accountability.
Yes, I don't think Sured's brilliant and does wonderful work. I like an even wider lens. I don't think, you know, accountability is the goal. I mean, it's lovely. Again, just like lower crime. Yay, I'm all for lower crime. I don't want people to think she wants crime to go up and she doesn't want accountability. I don't know what accountability means, though, in some of these situations where there is so much harm that has been done. I think that leads up by so many people and so many different actors, including state actors, leading up to the commission of a violent act.
I see. Yeah.
So accountability needs to be writ large and be very inclusively understood as an inclusive concept that involves all of the forces and
right. So education, healthcare, in that sort of, like, that wide society level.
Yeah, sure. Why not? And I also don't. I'm also a little wary, and you said this very quickly, so you might not even mean it. But I would be very, very. I'm wary of. I want victims to be restored and heard and engaged much more in our response to harm and violence than they currently are. I think it's awful the way in which we currently treat victims of crime in the criminal legal system. I am reluctant to suggest that we should ask victims whether they want how they want a case disposed of, whether they want the person who hurt them to go to prison or not go to prison, because to me, it's kind of a moot. We want what's best. We want the victim to be healed and to be supported, but we don't want the victim's philosophy of punishment to determine what happens in any particular situation.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I was just I was kind of crudely and impartially relating. I was trying to relate Sered's approach to it. That's all. Yeah,
yeah,
as I
but
understand it. But I see what you're saying.
yeah. I think one thing that no, let me stop. That's all. I'm gonna stop
That's
talking about
yeah,
that.
that's fine. That's fine. So I want to ask. We talked about this a little bit before folks joined, and I think we're still doing okay on time. Is that? I think Dr. Borden's gonna let us know when we need to stop gabbing. Um, so I want to go back to that question of like what we should be aiming at with a college and prison program, because I think I'm still forming my views, and so I want to hear what you have to say about what we should be doing. Right? How should we achieve if we're aiming at, and these might be different things. If we're aiming at social level goals, how do we do that on the individual level with students? Like should we be confined to, and you probably already answered this a little bit too, should we be confined to just what we're teaching, or should we push our teaching towards those community level goals? Like if I'll try to put it more succinctly. I've gotten pushback from people asking me why would I try to go at the end of a process and fix it, right? At the, like when someone's already incarcerated, when I could go back however you go back to K through 12, that's problematic because most of the opportunity gaps are already formed by the time someone goes to kindergarten. So go back before that. Why am I not like focused on prenatal care or like these other education? Like why focus on the end of the line on a back end issue when we could focus on a front end issue? And what does higher education have to say about those front end issues? Because I think they do. They have a lot to say about it.
That's a very rich and meaty question.
Unwieldy. You get unwieldy. That's I have a thing.
I just want to say that the question bespeaks a sort of a model of how things work that I want to that I don't share.
Yeah.
Let me put it that way.
Please.
And again, it's because I don't see this linear. One person hurts another person. This person hurt the other person, and now we're going to put them in a cage, and that's the end of the story. Put a bow on top, and we don't have to worry about that situation or be afraid of that person anymore. I see a larger. I keep on doing this, and people are going to get tired of me saying wider lens, in which, harms, including systemic harms, are happening all the time. And what Howard Zare, who talks about who is a restorative justice practitioner, and talks about the necessity of understanding the harms that are revealed through any act of violence. I like that formulation very much. It's the harms that are revealed through any act of violence, because it suggests that when we start to look at what's happening, I mean, so instead of using the wider lens, I'm going to use picking away at the onion metaphor now for variety's sake. Once we start to pick away and look at what gave rise to and resulted from and was implicated as part of any particular act of violence, we are going to see so many harms: interpersonal, systemic, relational, social, psychological, physical, environmental harms. And once we do, we are charged with addressing them. And I don't know who the we is in that sentence, but
I think there's a good case at the university.
Commitment, right?
Yeah.
Addressing them. And so it's one of the things. Okay, so that's one thing I want to say. I'm just going to say about that whole model of the harm is done there in the prison, it's over. No, it's not over. I want a system, I want a world in which we understand the ever the the necessity of not closing the book on any act of violence before we have committed the act of going into the onion and exploring and addressing. Two is people who are living in prison are not finished living. Almost by definition, they're still alive. By definition, they're still alive.
Yeah.
And while they are alive, I mean, so in some ways, I'm very traditional. In some ways, I'm very conservative, and I'm very conservative and traditional in the sense that I am. I believe in the promise of higher education. I believe in the promise of higher education to open hearts and minds and help people feel better connected to one another and appreciate their place in the world and the place of others in the world. I believe it's a liberalizing force, and at its best, it's a progressive force, but at least it's a liberalizing force, right? And I believe that that liberalizing force of quality higher education makes a difference no matter where it is practiced. And a prison is a place in which living people interact with one another, and it's it hurts me to think that some people think of a prison as a place where people are sort of in living coffins.
We say, I mean, we use the metaphor of warehousing, right, which implies like some static existence. You just put them on a shelf,
so.
and then you take them out of this thing and let them, yeah.
If we think that higher education holds promise to improve the quality of people's relations with one another, their relationship with each other, with themselves, with their families, to create a more meaningful life. I mean, I don't want to get into the issue, the studies that show more safety at prisons, but that's another set of research that's out there. Then there's nobody that I think we have a right to. There's no principled basis upon which I'm convinced that we should deny it to people who are incarcerated. They are not the end of the line. They are living.
I think that's beautiful. I think that's beautiful.
And I don't. We also understand, just one last thing, and I'm not going to say they're going to get out one day, because I really get tired of this trope. 95% of the people who are in prison are going to get out one day, and they might be your neighbor. Well, yeah, but I'm not doing this so that I protect my. It's not a family protective insurance policy, right? So even for those people who are not getting out, it's I can't remember what I was going to say.
Well, it's valuable for them, right? We should not exclude. Yeah, if we think that that higher education, and I love everything that you're saying. By the way, it's right in line with how I think about it. If we think that it's valuable for folks on campus, then it's just as valuable for folks who are incarcerated or detained or whatever.
And it's
regardless of whether they're ever going to get out.
And I want to say more than that too, and I absolutely agree with that. It's valuable for us as a society when we are better as a society. Any society is better as a community. When people are doing well, being thoughtful, being operating with a more sophisticated understanding of the world and themselves. That just it makes for better politics. It makes for better decision making. It makes for easier living. So that's another thing I want to say. It's because one thing I have found is that the argument that people who are in the fact that people who are in prison get meaning and satisfaction out of higher education isn't always very convincing for those people who believe that people who are in prison should be suffering. The last thing I want to say, and of course there are other ways that you have to confront people who believe people who are in prison should be suffering beyond the higher education question. And the last thing I want to say is that I think it's really important to acknowledge that in programs like, well, even on the campus, even on their traditional campus, and especially on programs like this, the learning is happening by everybody who participates. Which is just those words were way too long. Let me say it more directly. The teachers learn too. I mean, I learn from my teachers I learned from my students at Urbana-Champaign. I learned even more from the students at Danville Correctional Center. And part of the learning that's going on is the learning of the instructors and other people who are going to the prison. And through them, learning that's going on by everybody who's connected to them, right? To their family members, to their students on the traditional campus, to their colleagues. It is difficult. It's quite painful, right? In some communities, people know many people, including many family members who've been locked up. And because of the hyper-segregated nature of American society, there are other communities in which people don't know anybody who's been locked up. They've never been to a prison before.
Right.
They have no personal exposure to incarceration. And it's so important, politically important, for more people to better understand who's in prison, how prisons work, and why prisons are destructive. And I do think that higher education in prison, because I really appreciated the Emerson quote you had earlier for us. Universities do have a role to play in this. Some people, James Kilgore has called mass incarceration the civil rights issue of our time.
Yeah.
Universities have a role to play in civil rights issues of their time. We should be active. We should be involved. We should be generating knowledge about them. And we can't do that well unless we actually take our people on our feet and go into the prisons. So that's another, quite frankly, not only for the sake of learning and knowledge, but in order to do something with that learning and knowledge that, as Emerson might say, creates change in the world.
Yeah.
The higher education in prison program is not an end in itself.
Perfect. I think on that note, we'll turn to questions and answers, if that's all right. And especially because I can't add anything to what you just said. So let's keep it rolling. Yeah.
Well, thanks for that wonderful conversation. We do have a few questions that came in on the chat, and folks, feel free to put some more in there. Or as I said in the chat, if you'd like to speak to the panelists, you can certainly raise your hand, and I'll keep an eye on that as well. So Jackie had a question. For some of these new college and prison programs, how do we prevent or work with universities who are not acknowledging the differences Rebecca is talking about? And here, during this part of the conversation, you all were talking about just the bureaucratic obstacles, right? Like the pen issue and so forth, how different the learning environment is. Jackie says, almost proceeding blindly as if there is no difference teaching or learning in a correctional setting. So again, how do we prevent or work with universities?
I'll defer to the experts.
I'll just say, hey, Jackie, thank you so much for that question. I know Dale was planning to talk about this. It was on your list of questions anyway, the question of coalitions.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for universities to do this with, very much in the spirit in which we're doing this right now, right? Our two programs are learning from one another right now. In Illinois, there's a coalition of higher education and prison programs. I think it's really important for people who are new to this field, institutions, faculty members, whoever it is, who are new to this field, to take the time to learn from the accumulated knowledge, not all of which is in agreement with itself, but there's a body of knowledge that's been accumulating over the last 30 years of this generation of higher education and prison programs that helps people to understand, for example, or at least to interrogate the differences between teaching on a traditional campus and teaching at a prison, and the nature of working with departments of corrections, the particular challenges that incarcerated students face as opposed to students who are on the outside. For example, those are some of the broad categories of things that any program needs to go into with its eyes open. And fortunately, they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Of course, every jurisdiction is different. A program in Wyoming is going to look very different from I think in some ways, a program from Wyoming is going to look very different in some ways from a program in California, or I should say in Los Angeles. But there are certain things that we can learn from one another and at least use those as a basis for creating the individual aspects that will be more sensitive to the particular context of our program. So I want to give a strong endorsement for working in community in this work, for building collaborations and partnerships between program, between higher education and prison programs, for taking one's time to set up a program and doing the research and the learning, to figure out what best practices are, to figure out where the obstacles are going to lie, and to visit other programs in action, to talk to students in other programs and learn what has worked for in other prisons and other programs, and learn what has worked for them and what has not worked for them. So I am bemused and disappointed when I see institutions of higher education approach higher education in prison without the same sort of intellectual curiosity and humility that they would approach other scholarly endeavors. This is not just charity work. It's not that we throw some instructors into the prison, hope to collect some Pell dollars, and then feel like we're doing good in the world. This is as our conversation today suggests, right? A nuanced, complicated, fraught enterprise that deserves time, reflection, humility, and like anything important, others, the light and the wisdom of others to inform one's path. And Jackie, I hope that starts to respond to the question you had.
Thank you, Rebecca. So Yali is a librarian and is interested to know more about the library service for the EJP program.
I wonder if that's a mischievous kind of question, and with that, I would be very happy to jump to Yali, I don't know if you're aware what happened with our library at Danville Correctional Center a couple of years ago. And I don't know if you're actually asking me to speak to that incident or to speak more generally to the library at the prison. But I'll just keep on talking, and then you can maybe put something in the chat if I'm not in.
Yeah, she's yeah. Oh, Yali, I should say they are unmuted. So I'm going to unmute you if you want to clarify. Go ahead.
A couple of weeks ago. So I never, this is like an eye-opening for me because I have no idea about how library works in the EJP program, and there's a whole system, and it's just very different from our students on campus. And yeah, so I'm just kind of curious as to how everything goes from your perspective, and what can university library can do. I'm a social work librarian. Yeah.
Thank you for that question, Yali. So we work closely with the university library at the University of Illinois. I have grown to have such respect and regard for librarians since I started working with the Education Justice Project. My goodness, I can always count on them to be allies and brave and strong. So we work closely with the university library. We have a library at Danville Correctional Center. It's a fraught space, and since you weren't asking about that aspect of it, I won't go into that aspect of it, but I'll stick to your question, Yoli. We have about 4,000 volumes in the library. We call it the community library because we aspire for it to be a community space for the students. So it not only houses books and course reserves, but we also use it to host events like poetry readings and things of that. Sometimes we'll bring people from the outside to conduct poetry readings in the community library at Danville Correctional Center. So I refer to course reserves. Most of the collection is a circulating collection, and students can check out books and take them back to their cells. The library is limited to EJP students, but we hope and expect that a student who is an EJP student will check out books for their friends, because why not, right? I mean, that's the whole point. Books are good, so we want them to take out books for people on the wing who have questions about something, and they can take out our books. That's fine. The course reserves operate in this way. We have the courses that we're offering any semester, for example, maybe we're offering 5 courses. The instructors are invited to put together a course reserve list. Some instructors will not have any course reserves, and we've had instructors who have given us a list of like 75 books that they want on course reserves. We'll get those books out of the university library because of our partnership and our dependence on the very, very good people who at the university library, and they let us check out the books for the semester, and we will take them back to the prison. We'll put them on the course reserve shelf. will decide, the instructor will decide what kind of policy they want to have with respect to those books, depending on the way they'll be used in the class. For example, can students check them out for 2 weeks at a time? Should they be only used in the library because the demand for them will be so great, whatever. And then the books have at least a twofold purpose. The first is that they are supplementary texts to students in the course who, of course, do not have, I shouldn't say of course, because I don't know your position, but they don't have internet access. So we want to have as wide a reading range around the particular topics as possible. And I want to say more about that in a minute. The second is that the books serve as advertisement for students who are not in the class, because they have friends who are in the class and they will see the shelf. Wow, this is what you guys are reading? I didn't know that sociology of technology would be about this. Hey, let me check out some of these books. So it helps to represent the range of different ideas and disciplines and subjects. We're limited on space, but so the circulation of different course reserve shelves from semester to semester is a sort of temporary way of filling up the shelves with new topics on a semester by semester basis. I didn't say that very well, but I hope you understand what I meant by that. So again, we really rely on the university librarians. The other thing I wanted to say about that is that it's important, and this gets to something that I think maybe Dale and I were talking about off camera. Most of the people that work with the EJP program are liberal and progressive people who are liberal and progressive. And it's not because we screen for liberal and progressive people, but the kinds of people that tend to want to work with our program tend to be liberal and progressive. And we run much more liberal and progressive than our students. We have some students who are quite progressive, and we have some students who are not progressive and who, support different political candidates, for example, or different presidential candidates. And that's fine. That's the real world. We need to be really upfront and honest about that. One of the things it means is that our students, when they disagree with something that, even if it's not about politics, when they disagree with something that comes up in the classroom, but especially when it's about politics, there's nowhere that they can go. Our students on campus, if I said something about prison abolition, I happen to be an abolitionist, they would Google why prison abolition is a stupid idea and come back to me the next week with all sorts of, remarks about why I was completely misguided in supporting prison abolition. One of the things we ask our instructors to do is collect books for their course reserves. They don't have to teach these books, but they need to make them available. We ask them to make them available to our students that oppose some of the principles and ideas and approaches that they'll be using in the class. I think it's so important. It's respectful to the students that they have access to opposing ideas. And that's another important function of that library space.
Thank you. So Christopher asks, to what extent, if any, is there an ethical imperative for HEP programs and the broader HEP community to explicitly work to center incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people as leaders in this space? If there is such an imperative, what are the challenges and opportunities of this work?
That's a great question. I have a hard one with this one because I'm not formally incarcerated, and we don't have anybody who's in leadership within EJP who's formally incarcerated, and that's true for most programs. I don't think the imperative to center the leadership, I don't know if the question was leadership or voices. I don't think that the imperative is to center what was it? Leadership?
Leadership.
Yeah. And I don't think the imperative is to center the leadership of formerly incarcerated people as much as it is the voices and perspectives of formerly incarcerated people. One reason I say that is because I think many programs, including our own, would be frozen if we felt that we couldn't do our job if we didn't have formerly incarcerated people in leadership positions. Because we have a hard time attracting talent to Central Illinois. And I think we would have and I know because we already all of our positions say we have a affirmative interest in hiring people who are formerly incarcerated and system impacted. So we try, and we have a hard time finding candidates that are. I think the field, I'm not sure we're ready yet in terms of demographics to ensure that all prison education programs, or at least even half prison education programs in the country, are led by formerly incarcerated people or systems impacted people. I do think we're going to continue to try. I don't mean to say, and Chris knows I admire him. We're going to keep on trying. We're going to keep on, in lieu of having leadership that is formerly incarcerated, we're going to continue to center the voices. That's part of our mission of formerly incarcerated people. We have people who are formerly incarcerated working with EJP in other capacities, not at the director level. I also am a little, I know among our students and among our alumni, we haven't seen a lot of interest in getting involved in higher education in prison. What we see much more is an interest in community level work in the communities from which they come. And maybe that's because we haven't had anybody go on to get a PhD yet. We've had a couple who've gotten master's degrees, but we haven't had anybody go on and decide to become a scholar. And we support and we work with some of our alumni who are involved in community level initiatives, sometimes in leadership positions in those community anti-violence initiatives or restorative justice initiatives and so on, youth mentoring initiatives. And I think that's something I want to better understand. I'll just say that I want to better understand that. And we certainly don't encourage our alum or our students to think about coming back to this space and operating as a leader within this space, because they have so many other things that are more clearly to them from their positions, either as incarcerated people or as alum who go back. Most of our students go back to Chicago. That seem to them to be more, that they communicate to me that they see as more pressing needs. But you can see me stumbling a bit because I think it's a really important question, not just that question in particular, Chris, but the question more broadly about the roles and engagement of formerly incarcerated people. And I'll stop. There's more I want to say, but I'll stop because I see the time.
I have a feeling this conversation could go on much longer, but we are close to time. So I wanted to work in a quick practical question from James. Is the reentry guide you mentioned available to view or purchase? We're starting a BBA program for prisoners in Jackson, Michigan, and I would love to incorporate reentry resources into the program.
Yeah, if you go, oh, you have our website. I think you put our website up there.
I did actually, yeah.
At the
I
top
can
of the
do that
chat.
again. Yep.
And so if you go to our website, is it James?
James.
There are several tabs at the top, and one of them says reentry. And if you click on that tab, you'll see how you can either download a PDF of the reentry guide or order physical copies. And my suggestion, if you have a group of people who are working together on this project, is that you order some physical copies. We'd be happy to send them to you. I also want to say that one of the things we've been doing as a reentry guide initiative is working with people in other jurisdictions, especially other higher education and prison programs, to help them establish their own reentry guides, because we think ours are very, very good. And good because they center the voices, again, of formerly incarcerated people. We have a formerly incarcerated advisory council that help guide what happens, and that we they're much more humane and welcoming than the tone of many reentry guides. So you can also, James, feel free to reach out to me or to anybody that you find on the website to ask to begin a conversation about how we might support your efforts. We've worked with people in Tennessee and Alabama and Florida and adapting the reentry guide for their own purposes. Of course, you want to take a look at the reentry guide first and see if it's what you're thinking about. But if it is something like what you want to produce, we would be happy to do any of the above that I've just laid out as options. And thank you for asking about that.
Wonderful. So I think we are at time. I'm not seeing any hands up. So I think it's time for everybody to, well, thank our guests here. Wonderful conversation between Dale and Rebecca. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today, and for the wonderful work you're doing. I am inspired, and I know everybody listening is as well. So I'm going to clap. Feel free to use those reaction icons at the bottom. And I hope that I will see some of you at future Ethics Centers events this semester and the next semester as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody. And Dale, especially thank you. What a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine. Thank you so much for taking the time and for agreeing to come and do this. Thank you, Dr. Borden, as well, for moderating.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Dale. Thanks for conceiving of this program. I appreciate it. And for your fine work as well.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.